Hey guys, it's Alex and I'm here with another book review. I know I said I was done with my bad reviews of thrillers. I said this several times. I said there would be no more, that I was liking the last one. I lied. I read Second Life by S.J. Watson, which is the second novel by the author who wrote Before I Go to Sleep, which I did thoroughly enjoy despite giving it 3 stars. This I was hoping to enjoy more, but I thought Before I Go to Sleep was by far the better book. Second Life is about a woman whose sister is murdered, and it kind of follows her in the year or so after her sister's death, as she is both kind of curiously looking into what happened to her sister, as well as living her own life. She doesn't do a lot of investigating, per se, but she is kind of searching for more information about it as the story progresses. It's a lot more about her relationship with a man who's not her husband, and her kind of descent into figuring out who she is and what matters to her. Normally my reviews are completely spoiler free, so you don't have to worry about anything, and I try very hard not to give anything away. But with this book, I have to talk about some of the things that happened in it because they are so crucial to my thoughts and overall view on the book. I'm not going to talk about any of the plot points past the halfway mark, but because this is a thriller and because there's honestly so little information about this book floating around, like so few descriptions, I thought that I should give the warning that I will be talking about some things that happen up to the halfway point. I don't think I'm going to be giving away any major spoilers or anything, but I know people are quite touchy about thrillers and I understand why, so this is just a warning in case you really don't want to know anything. I was really excited to pick this up after I finished Before I Go to Sleep, because even though that book wasn't my favorite and I didn't like the amnesia plotline so much, I did think the writing was really well done and that S.J. Watson did a great job with the characters and the story. I thought this might be even better because it didn't deal with the amnesia in the same way, but I wound up being very disappointed. I did not like the characters in this book. In Before I Go to Sleep, there were so few characters that they all had very distinct personalities and I could differentiate between them very well. But in this book, there were a lot more characters and they all felt very bland. I would honestly struggle really hard to describe any of the characters except for the main character's husband. He was the only character who had a very distinct personality for me. The rest of them were just a series of actions that often made no sense or had very little motivation, including the villain. I didn't understand a lot why the villain or the villains were doing what they were doing or why. There was a reason, but it wasn't a very logical reason and it didn't make a lot of sense to me. And I just was bored with the characters. I had difficulty telling them apart. There were so few dialogue tags that I felt I often didn't know who was speaking. Even when there were conversations with just 2 characters, I wouldn't know who was speaking. I didn't know which lines belonged to whom. And sometimes I couldn't even figure out within context who was saying what. It was just a really frustrating and strange experience. And I honestly stopped caring about who was speaking at certain points. They also all called each other darling, regardless of their relationship. I've never heard the word darling so much as I did in this book. It was getting to the point where it was ridiculous. I do understand that that's probably a more common term of endearment in England than it is in America, but it was excessive. It was ridiculous to read it. To read all of these characters constantly refer to each other as darling. I also felt like there were a lot of secrets being kept, and I understand that it is a thriller, so to an extent there will be a lot of secrets being kept. But within this book, I feel like the information the reader isn't supposed to know was constantly pointed out, to an extent that it really frustrated me. Julia would often have inner dialogue where she would say things along the lines of, "I hope she doesn't ask how I met my ex-boyfriend," and then just leave it at that, and it wouldn't come up again for sometimes 50 plus pages, and it was incredibly frustrating. It's not that I cared so much that it was a secret being kept from me, it was that it was constantly pointed out, and the author was rubbing my face in all the information I didn't know, and I found that really frustrating to read. I also found it very predictable. Whereas with Before I Go to Sleep, there were constantly a lot of options where the story could go, and I believed that it could have gone any of them. But with this, a character could do something or say something and immediately just telegraph the next 100 pages of the book. And it kept happening. Like, I wouldn't be able to predict the ending at the beginning of the book, but a character would say something, I'd be like, oh, well, that's going to happen in the first half of the book. Oh, that's going to happen in the middle of the book. Oh, that's how it's going to end. Like, as the book went along. And it was just really, like, I wasn't figuring it out as it went. I was just sort of like, by the time I was halfway through, I knew exactly how this book was going to end. And it wasn't a great reading experience for that reason. I don't always mind when books are predictable. This one just became quite frustrating to a point, and I really didn't enjoy the way that it was written. But despite all of that, I was still enjoying this book. It wasn't the greatest thriller I'd ever read, and it wasn't as good as Before I Go to Sleep, but it was quite an interesting book, and I was invested, I was enjoying it. I was planning to give it 3 stars. But then the main character got into rape fantasy with her boyfriend. And this is the part where it's going to get a little bit spoilery. So if you are very touchy, just be warned. The main character, Julia, who honestly I didn't know her name until about halfway through the book. And it was kind of frustrating that no one would ever say her name, they just all called her Darling. But tangent over. Julia met this guy online. And at first it was because she was investigating what happened to her sister. But then it sort of became something else, and she started having an affair with this man. It was very graphic sexually, which I didn't mind so much, like, it's whatever. But then she started getting a little into rape fantasy with this man. And that made me uncomfortable. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with rape fantasy, but it's just something I really dislike reading about. It's very unpleasant to me. I would rather read a book about rape than read a book that includes rape fantasy. It makes me just incredibly uncomfortable all around. And there was a lot of it in this book. Just a lot of their games and their consensual roleplay that obviously it's a thriller, so it took a turn and became less and less consensual as time went on. But it was just very, very awful for me to read, and it wasn't the kind of thing I could ever enjoy reading. If I had known that's kind of where this book was going, I really wouldn't have picked it up. Especially because this is written by a man. He gave a female character a rape fantasy. And that was just super gross to me. That's not ever something I can get behind. I really didn't enjoy that, and it soured this whole book for me. I wound up giving it 2 stars, but I do see how someone who has different interests and tastes in books than me could really enjoy this. I understand higher ratings on this book, whereas with some of the other thrillers in the past that I reviewed, I don't. I do think it's pretty well written. I do think it has a very interesting plot. It just wasn't the book for me, although if you look up this book and it sounds like something you might be interested in, I do completely understand why. I just don't think I will be picking up any more S.J. Watson books in the future, and if you are interested in reading his books, I would highly recommend Before I Go to Sleep over this one. As always, thank you for watching my videos, and please do let me know down below if you've read this book or if you're interested in reading it. I always like to hear your thoughts and opinions on the books that I read. Bye, guys!